Welcome to The Green Urbanist, the podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Today we're taking a step outside cities to explore reforestation and rewilding, in conversation with biologist Tiago de Zoeten. Tiago is a conservation biologist at Mossy Earth, a social enterprise on a mission to restore nature and fight climate change. He studied biology at the University of Edinburgh and biostatistics at UCM in Madrid, and has research experience in ecology and conservation genetics. At Mossy Earth, he is working on bringing exciting rewilding projects to life and applying his love for data to develop resources to help people live more sustainably. In this episode, we discuss the importance of planting native species and letting forests grow wild, what rewilding is all about and how it plays a role in fighting climate change, why we need to create and restore ecosystems, the role of wild places and animals in our cultures and history, and finally, how you can approach reducing your own carbon footprint. Throughout the episode, Tiago tells us about how he's putting these principles into practice at projects for Mossy Earth. So what is Mossy Earth? Well, it's a really interesting company. It's a membership format, so you sign up as a member for £10 a month, and they use that money to plant trees and fund rewilding projects across Europe, with plans to expand even further. They're currently engaged in tree planting and rewilding projects in Scotland, Ireland, Portugal, Romania and Slovakia. To give you a sense of the scale of their operations, earlier this year they planted 3,000 trees in the Scottish Highlands. They're on track to plant 25,000 trees this year in Slovakia and a further 30,000 trees in Romania. They achieved this by working with local experts and tree planters in each country, so these projects are also supporting local green jobs. I'm a Mossy Earth member myself, that's how I found out about them, and as you can tell, I'm pretty impressed with them as a company. I just wanted to give you a bit of background on them before we jump into the podcast, where we talk more about the specifics of reforestation and rewilding. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe or follow the podcast so you don't miss an episode. Follow the podcast on Instagram at Green Urbanist Pod and Twitter at Green Urban Pod for more content and news. And you can find out more about Mossy Earth on their website, which is mossy.earth, and on their Instagram and the Mossy Earth podcast. All the links for this stuff is in the podcast description, as well as other links to interesting talks and articles we mentioned throughout the episode. Here is my conversation with Tiago. So I'm here with Tiago from Mossy Earth via video call. I'm in London, you're in Portugal, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe that's a bit of a teaser because we can get in later to what you're actually doing in Portugal. But first of all, just say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's great to talk to you.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me on the podcast. I'm very happy to be here and that I can contribute to this great initiative that you started.
Awesome. I guess just so we know who we're listening to, who we're talking to, maybe we can just start off by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what do you do, and where does your interest in climate change and forestation come from?
Yeah, so I'm a conservation biologist at Mossy Earth, and I think that it's fair to say that sort of a passion and an interest in nature is maybe like a running theme that runs across most of the things I do and have been doing for a long time now. So I'm half Dutch, half Portuguese. I was born in the Netherlands, but I've lived most of my life in Portugal until I left for university. And yeah, well, I think even like from a young age, I was already quite interested in spending time in nature, and that's always been there, you know. And then having that interest, when I started learning a bit more about biology in high school and so on, that sort of extra layer of understanding sort of made me appreciate like how beautiful and interesting living things are. Like, so this extra layer of understanding sort of made me even more interested. And that sort of like led me on to want to follow a career in research in biology. So even from a young age, I was already like set on that idea, you know. And so I went to university to study biology, went to the University of Edinburgh. And that sort of I became really interested in the fields of population genetics and conservation biology, and which eventually led me then to, when I finished my degree, to do a research scholarship that involved in this field. So it involved doing field work in Madagascar with lemurs.
Wow.
And also doing some programming and simulation work. So the two sides of the spectrum within biology, being in the field and being behind the screen programming, which is great for me because I enjoy all aspects of it.
Yeah, that's I mean, I am slightly jealous of when I look at your Mossy Earth Instagram feed and images on your website. You always seem to be out in the forest interacting with animals, that kind of thing, not working from home in an inner city flat like me, but we all have our role to play, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there is also like a lot of work behind the scenes that is like difficult work, but yeah, exactly. But the time when we are in the field, yeah, it really is amazing, and I personally feel very grateful that I have this opportunity. To be honest, like the what I'm doing now at Mossy Earth is essentially my dream job, so I'm quite happy about that.
That's brilliant. Well, maybe that's a nice segue then, if you can just give us an overview of what is Mossy Earth. What do you do? What kind of services do you provide?
Yeah, so essentially Mossy Earth, it's a membership that restores nature. I think that's the simplest way to describe it. So we carry out a range of projects, and that have like at their core goal to restore degraded ecosystems. And so it's an opportunity for members and people who care to actually contribute to the natural world, and it's very much built on this idea that we can leave it in a better state than we found it, So we're very much focused on also this positive message. So a lot of times conservation, sometimes conservation is it's talked about in terms of preventing damage, preventing degradation of of the natural world, but there's also this huge opportunity with areas that are already degraded to actually do something positive, and that's what's behind most of our work. So with this membership, we plant 4 trees for each member per month, and then every 2 months members can vote on a rewilding project. So this is a way that people can actually be engaged and actually make decisions about which projects we implement. And then we also provide a bunch of resources to help people live more sustainably. So this is a bit like the way we see it is that we're tackling the environmental issues from all kinds of different angles, so that people feel that they sort of have this whole sort of toolkit to address this. And yeah, that's in a nutshell what the membership is about. Yeah.
I think that's a great point about taking a positive approach to it. I mean, I've said before on a previous episode that for decades the narrative around climate change has been one of guilt and about telling people that they're doing things wrong, that they're destroying the planet, their kind of consumer lifestyles are the problem. And of course, if you start by berating people, it's very hard then to motivate them to actually do something positive. And I think switching that narrative to saying, actually, we have a huge opportunity here. Okay, yes, we've done damage in the past. We need to acknowledge that. But now let's use this opportunity to, as you said, leave the world in a better state than where we found it, particularly, the natural world. So I think that's a great message.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's really important. And, on the one hand, for me, like as I learned more and more about the state of our ecosystems in many places, for example, in Europe as well, the more you learn about it, sometimes the more you look at the landscape that before you thought was like perfectly fine and natural landscape, and you see all of the layers of human impact that are on that landscape. So the more you learn, the more you're aware of the issue. But then I also started to look at with those eyes of thinking, okay, all of these issues, you can see them as opportunities. So and you use them as motivation and thinking, okay, here's something where I really can have an impact. And I think with that attitude, we will get much further than if we're just in all doom and gloom.
Yeah, exactly. And a big part of what so as it just for the people listening, I am a Mossy Earth member. I give my £10 a month as a membership to Mossy Earth. And one of the things that's interesting about Mossy Earth is it's not a charity or an NGO. It's just a private company, normal limited company, but the whole ethos behind it is to do good in the world and to, as you said, restore ecosystems and all that kind of thing. Their business model is very interesting. We won't get too much into it here because it's a bit maybe off topic for our conversation. But I just suggest people go to the Mossy Earth website and have a look into that and see how they're doing things, I think, very differently to a lot of other people in this sort of space. One of the things that I think is really differentiates Mossy Earth is that you're very transparent about all the methodologies you use for things like reforestation and rewilding. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that's a great point. So for us, in terms of the way we want to develop trust is essentially by showing all our members and everyone the evidence of what we do, so that there's no sort of barrier between what's happening on the ground and our members, so that you can check it out for yourself. And so we have all of these different ways of doing that. In terms of the reforestation work, we send our members a photo of every tree we plant and the GPS coordinates, as well as the planting polygon, so the area where you can find the tree. And what this means is that if you want, you could just go there yourself and see how the trees are doing, which a lot of people find that's reassuring. And we for our rewilding projects, we also try to include people as much as possible. So a lot of times I think that there can be a bit of a condescending sort of feel to what conservation organizations are doing, in the sense that it's like these people who want to fund our work, they don't really know about the topic, and so it feels like there's a big gap between the people that are doing the work and the people that are supporting it, and we sort of want to bridge that gap and get people more involved, because people do they are really interested in the details and in actually having a positive impact, and we're trying to get that to work to our advantage.
Well, speaking of the details, let's get into a few of them. So I'd love to know, particularly, maybe we can start with the tree planting and about how every tree is not equal, we'll say, and planting any tree is not really what it's about for Mossy Earth. So can you tell us a little bit about how you do it differently compared to maybe what people are familiar with when they think of forestry projects or tree planting projects, is rows and rows of the same species of tree. That's not really what the Mossy Earth forests look like when you look at the images online. So can you tell us a bit about why that's different?
Yeah, definitely not. So that's a great point, and so that people often associate planting a tree as something that's inherently good. But that's not necessarily the case. Like the wrong tree in the wrong place can actually do a lot of damage. So, for example, planting non-native species in certain areas can lead, and in certain densities can lead to soil acidification, problems with sedimentation in rivers, and in some cases it can even lead to carbon emissions. For example, if trees are planted where peat bogs exist, they will be destabilizing the soil there and leading to the carbon that's stored on the peat bogs to be released.
Wow.
So it's not as simple as it may seem, and it's as with many things, the more you learn about it, the more you understand that the amount of nuance and complexity there is in terms of how you carry out these reforestation projects. We focus on planting only native species in places where they would grow naturally, and also on planting a diversity of species. So not just a given species that will grow fast or will be great for only carbon sequestration, because our goal is to actually create a mature wild forest in that area that will stay there for many years to come, and that will provide a great habitat for wildlife. because that's essentially what's the Mossy Earth mission is to actually have a functioning ecosystem where before there was a degraded landscape. So, and that comes across in how we do reforestation, of course.
Okay, I see. So the goal is not just to absorb as much carbon as possible, as efficiently as possible, maybe by planting a particular tree type that naturally will absorb a lot. It's more about creating a sort of something that mimics more of a natural space and allowing that to grow more wild.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what we're aiming for. And also the areas we work at for reforestation, they are generally they will become part of a broader conservation area. So that the idea is that, this area is actually being managed for that purpose, So it's not just that we're planting native trees randomly without knowing like the broader context. It's actually like this will, for example, in this Southern Carpathians in Romania, the areas where we are planting in these illegal clear cuts, the idea is that this will eventually become a national park. So all of this sort of adds together with our rewilding project, so that it all comes together into something that really has an impact. That's the idea for us.
That's great. A question that I have as a Mossy Earth member, as well as just someone who's interested, is obviously when you plant trees, they're obviously just very small, little twigs almost that just get put in the soil. How do you make sure that they end up growing into a mature tree that will last for maybe hundreds of years?
Yeah, so the first few years after sapling is planted are the ones where mortality is most likely. So this can be between 3 and 10 years. And so during those years, we monitor survival of the trees, and we adjust. So we replant as necessary, because depending on the years and the conditions, this can vary. But then after that point, we then the idea is to focus more on the health of the forest as a whole, rather than on individual trees, because the idea is that you want the forest to develop naturally as well. So if there's a tree mortality for some reason, like there's a felling of one of the larger trees, that's also part of the ecosystem. So that's something that they call heterogeneity in the forest, and that's also important for different kinds of organisms to have that sort of variation, so that's not just a whole bunch of standing healthy trees. Yeah, so it's a matter from that point on. It's monitoring changes a little bit in character, and it's more about monitoring exactly on the one hand forest cover, general forest health, and the growth of the trees.
We mentioned a few of the projects. You mentioned a few as you were talking. One of them was the Southern Carpathians in Romania. Where else are you doing work with reforestation?
Yeah, so for reforestation, we have completed 2 projects in Portugal. We've reached capacity with those projects. We also have projects in Ireland, a project in Scotland, and one that we recently launched in Slovakia, which is on floodplains. So it's slightly different ecosystem.
How do you go about selecting the areas that you'll choose to plant trees in? What's the sort of methodology for that?
Yeah, so first of all of these aspects we were talking about in terms of being able to restore forests in areas where they actually existed. So we don't carry out afforestation, so just planting trees wherever, right? So the areas need to be suitable in that sense, and then they need to be areas where there is sort of this opportunity. So where there is land that can be used for this purpose, so in this case in the Southern Carpathians, that we had these partners which we could work with to actually do this in scale, to cover these clear cuts, and then in terms of how we approach the selection procedure, then we also want to make sure that we can have guarantees that the forest will be protected in the future, and that the species being planted and that the whole approach is ecologically sound, so that it's actually contributing to the restoration of this area.
Okay, so it isn't just about acquiring land anywhere. You have to work with
Yeah.
local people and figure out where's this actually needed.
Exactly, and I mean, so we work in different places, and maybe it's not entirely obvious from a member's perspective yet, but we of course work with a whole bunch of different experts on each location, because this, even though you can know a lot about forestry, about ecology, and so on, like each area is so peculiar that you really need to work with local people that have been there for a long time and that know the ecosystem, the issues, the potential, pitfalls and all of that, so that you can do a good job.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think from my personal perspective, you have this project in the west of Ireland, in County Clare, which is a reforestation project. And you had a nice little history piece on your website where you said that Ireland used to be the most forested country in Europe, until basically when it became part of the British Empire, the forests were cut down for construction and for shipbuilding and that kind of thing. And now if you visit Ireland, it's known as the place of rolling pastures and, basically grassland. So you could almost make an argument that, somewhere like that, you're not finding gaps in existing forest systems. You're actually having to create them again fresh, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of those examples where I think it's interesting as well, the role of people's understanding of the ecosystem. Because if it's been like that for a long time, then it sometimes, I think it becomes difficult for people to imagine that it could be otherwise. So that's why, for example, on that article, I think it's important to mention the history there, that we're not just thinking, it would be nice if Ireland was covered in trees. It's like the only reason it isn't is because of our influence on it.
Yeah.
It comes back to what we were saying before. The way you look at the landscape changes the more you learn about it. And this is exactly one of those cases where first you look at Ireland, it looks beautiful. Then you realize it should be covered in trees and you're a bit depressed. But then you think, here's an opportunity.
Oh, exactly.
And then you turn it around and you say, okay, here's a good opportunity to do something great.
Excellent. And also in the Scottish Highlands, it's a similar story as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a similar story. And in the Scottish Highlands, there's also this dynamic with very high deer densities, which are a huge problem because they prevent natural regeneration. The issue here is that in the absence of large predators, which were hunted to extinction, local extinction, the deer populations are out of control, and the land has actually managed to have these high deer densities for sporting, so for hunting. And so with such high densities, they just eat all the saplings. And so it becomes very difficult to actually have natural regeneration occurring in this area. And so it's problems like these, I think, that for us are interesting as well, because it shows that tackling this requires a holistic understanding of the ecosystem. Everything is sort of connected in this way, and you need to really understand all these processes if you want to have a large and sort of long-lasting impact on the area.
Yeah, it's incredibly complex, isn't it? I mean, just as we're talking about Scotland, what would some of the large predators have been in the past?
Yeah, so it would have been wolves, bears in the area. They would have had lynx, even though they prey on smaller mammals, and all of this, and they would influence the ecosystem in multiple ways. So there's this effect of actually eating the deer, for example, but then also in terms of the way they behave. So once these animals know that they can be preyed upon, that there are predators around, they behave differently. They move around more, they look around more, they just behave differently, and that sort of gives an opportunity for the saplings to grow. It just creates a different dynamic, and that has a big impact on the whole ecosystem.
If you can imagine watching one of those David Attenborough nature shows where the wildebeest on the African plains are hanging out in their huge herd and just eating grass, and then all of a sudden a lion or something appears and they just run. So that's the similar sort of effect you'd expect. And what it does is it stops the wildebeest just eating everything in the area and moving them on, and then it allows the land to recover, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And for me, I mean, these things, I think that they're just very interesting the way that these things work. That, you know, just one, even like a small number of animals can have such a huge impact on the whole landscape. I think it's quite amazing, and it also sort of speaks to the potential of these interventions. Even though a lot of these things sort of still require research, because it's not that easy to have, you know, to do experiments and to have a very controlled understanding of exactly how these things will play out. But it does show with several case studies that there is huge potential to like have a large impact, even if you do a relatively small intervention, you know. So that's very exciting for us.
That's interesting. That's interesting. If people want to see a great visual representation of this, I'd suggest they check out a TED talk that George Monbiot gave a few years ago, which is about reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone National Park in California, and about how the wolves not only helped to keep the deer population in check, but they also started to influence the landscape. And as you said, it's this very complex system that we sort of don't know what's going to happen until it does happen. And then we monitor it and we say, amazing, the wolves being in this landscape made the rivers change course and made, you know, certain vegetation grow that hadn't been there for decades. So that's a really good one to check out. And I guess when people talk about rewilding, when they hear about rewilding, they immediately think of these large predators like wolves or lynx. And there's even people working on cloning the woolly mammoth to reintroduce the woolly mammoth into particular environments. And obviously, you know, these sort of megafauna are very charismatic and they really capture our imagination. But it's not the whole story, is it? I noticed from the Mossy Earth projects, you look at, you know, you deal with a lot of animals and a lot of projects on a much smaller scale, smaller animals that play particular niches, you know, in their ecosystem. So I'd love to learn a bit more about maybe why it's not just about, you know, bringing back the big species. It's also about looking after all the other species that are in there.
Yeah. That's a great question. So rewilding is sort of a term that's become quite popular in recent years. And yeah, even though it is associated exactly as you're saying with these larger animals and with reintroductions in particular, it can be understood more broadly as a slightly different perspective on the traditional way to think about conservation. So if you think about it, conservation work in general can be thought of as protecting what's already there to a large extent. So it's more about finding these areas of pristine nature and trying to keep them that way.
Okay.
And rewilding sort of comes a little bit as a way to change the focus there and to say, actually now, like, we have so much degraded landscapes and ecosystems that have been changed by human influence so much that's no longer necessarily that we need to do something else as well. And so it's about giving nature essentially a helping hand so that it can, so that ecosystem processes that are gone can return. So as we were discussing, so the presence of predators and these kinds of processes, that they can return, but that then we can leave nature to its own devices, essentially. That's where the wild part comes in. So the idea is we want to do what we can to correct or to address these issues, but to then create an environment that is wild and self-sustaining, essentially.
Okay.
So that's the way, essentially, in very sort of vague terms, what rewilding is about.
That's a really good introduction to sort of thinking about it more broadly. So can you tell us a bit about some of Mossy Earth's rewilding projects?
We have several different projects going on. One of them, the most recent one we had a vote on, was to support the use of livestock guarding dogs in Portugal.
Okay.
And this is something that might not immediately come across as rewilding, because it obviously has something to do with humans. But once you understand the context of it, then it makes a bit more sense. So this is an area in northern Portugal where there's a subpopulation of Iberian wolves that is threatened with extinction, and where there's conflict with local farmers. because wolf attacks can be quite common in some regions, and this then leads to illegal persecution of the wolves.
Is this attack on livestock?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, okay. That's right. Yeah, and so this can be an important economic burden for the farmers, and so the attitudes can change and can lead to the illegal persecution of the wolves. And the use of livestock guarding dogs, it's been used in many different places, and it's really quite effective at reducing the chances of these wolf attacks occurring, and that essentially helps to mediate this conflict.
So how does this work with the dogs? Do they basically keep guard on the property?
So essentially they are handed over to the farmers when they're still quite young, because it's very important that they establish a bond. So a few weeks ago I went up there to visit one of the dogs, and he was really attached to the flock of sheep that he was guarding, and that happened because from a young age he was kept living with the flock, so he starts to know the animals so that's an important component. And then they have been bred for this purpose for centuries, so they already have this instinct to guard the animals. And then it appears like almost magical that they do this so well.
Amazing. So this is actually quite an old method.
Yeah, it is. And yeah, exactly. The social context is really interesting here as well, because what happened really was that wolves started to disappear from these areas, and that led to the practices that used to so that people used to have these livestock guarding dogs because there were wolves in the area, and now that the wolves were gone, they stopped using them, which made them vulnerable to attacks once the wolves returned.
Okay.
But then they don't necessarily then revert to the solutions of the past, but can sometimes lead to the illegal persecution. So it's a matter of returning these practices so that it becomes normal again to coexist with wolves, essentially.
That's fascinating. This particular population of wolves, are they a species that's been reintroduced, or have they always existed there?
No, they have always existed in the area. But they are the area we are working on. It's sort of at the periphery of the range of the Iberian wolf in Portugal. So there's a larger population that's north of the Douro River, which is this large river in the north of Portugal.
Okay.
And so it can be thought of as a sort of recolonization area for the Iberian wolf, essentially. So that it's not like they're being introduced by anyone. It's just that they're gradually returning to these areas that are being essentially abandoned, because there's a lot of rural abandonment in the area, and that sort of gives an opportunity, creates habitat again for these predators.
Is this people moving to cities, the sort of agricultural industry sort of reducing?
Exactly. That's happening a lot in the center of Portugal. And that's also one of the reasons why there's so many opportunities for rewilding. And also to sort of bring back, for example, tourism can be a way to bring back some benefits, some economic benefits to the local community as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess, this problem with the sort of human interaction with these sort of large predators, I guess, is why we're missing. The species have been driven to extinction in so many parts of Europe. So, I guess the question is, if hundreds of years ago we were having these problems, what if we reintroduced wolves and lynxes and things like that? How do we then make sure we don't have the same issue? Is it these sort of methods like the guarding dogs? Is there enough space for them, I guess, is another question. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, in terms of the point you said, it would require essentially implementing methods like this. So being prepared to coexist with them. And in terms of space, this trend of rural abandonment in Europe, it's not just happening. It's just not just happening in Portugal. It's actually quite widespread in Europe. So in terms of habitat, there is quite a lot of opportunity for these predators to recolonize. And so as long as it's done correctly and that the people that are actually like stakeholders are involved, so that they're not left out. That it has been shown in many different case studies that coexistence is possible.
Okay.
So that's what we're trying to aim for here.
Yeah, you just have to take the right approach, I suppose, and bring the local community along with you.
Exactly, because the moment they feel that they're excluded and that decisions are being made without including them, that's the moment where they'll turn to legal prosecution and to getting matters into their own hands, of course, which is understandable.
Fascinating. I mean, I guess one of the questions I have in terms of the wider context for this is obviously rewilding is something that we maybe think is beneficial for its own sake, because we believe it's important to undo some of the mistakes of the past that humans have made. But in terms of the wider context of climate change, what is the role of rewilding? Why is it important for fighting climate change?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question. This idea of what is the value of, for example, conserving species, and because some people, sometimes it just feels like okay, it's nice, but why is that so important? But I think this requires a little bit of a change in perspective in terms of understanding what is happening at the global scale now, because climate change is obviously this huge issue, and I mean we are very much working to contribute to tackling it. But I think what we're witnessing is not a set of isolated problems requiring isolated solutions. It's more that we're facing the complete collapse of many ecosystems. So, and this includes the issue of climate change. So we're seeing rates of species loss that make it so that we can call this a sixth mass extinction. And so all of these things are happening at the same time, and essentially addressing climate change on its own would not solve many of the other issues that this is causing. So ecosystems provide all kinds of services. This includes food, for example, marine ecosystems with fishing. That's just a very simple example. They help with flood prevention, the air quality. There's so many things that we derive from nature that aren't addressed simply by reducing carbon emissions. So that's one way to answer that question. But then in terms of actually how rewilding, there are also like interesting ways in which rewilding can actually help to fight climate change. So on a sort of more abstract level, if you're bringing an ecosystem that's degraded this to a better ecological state, this often involves an increased biomass in the area. So you'll have more living organisms in the area, and biomass, essentially, that's carbon there. So that's a very sort of physicist way of looking at this.
Plants are made of carbon, after all.
Yeah, exactly. But then, of course, each intervention, I mean, there are all kinds of sources and sinks of carbon. But there are some very interesting examples of how this can work. So one of them was the case of deer in Scotland. If we manage to control that population of deer, for example, with the reintroduction of predators there, then that could have a huge impact on the whole landscape in Scotland by allowing these trees to grow back. And so that's rewilding at its sort of finest, having a huge impact on climate change. And then there are some like other crazy examples, like for example, whales, where they say that on the one hand, just the animals themselves, like when they die, they sink to the bottom of the ocean, and the carbon that's stored in that carcass actually is quite stable once it gets to the bottom of the ocean.
Oh, okay.
So that's like a literal, like a literal carbon sink with that. And they also, another amazing thing is that as they dive very deep, and then as they return to feed on phytoplankton and krill and so on, they go quite deep, and then when they return, they bring loads of nutrients closer to the surface. So the feces from the whales, so these what they call these punamis, released at the surface, they actually they're very useful for the phytoplankton that's at the surface, which then can grow faster, and that of course, like through photosynthesis, is capturing carbon. And so the net effect can be, even though these things are hard to quantify, there are some papers suggesting that this can be a large carbon sink as well.
Wow, incredible. I mean, it really takes pulling together all this knowledge that we have about how individual animals behave and how they interact with the ecosystem, and then thinking about it in this bigger perspective to sort of understand the benefits.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's really important to think about it in that way, that we sort of, given that it is a complex and multifaceted issue that we're facing in terms of what's happening to ecosystems worldwide, that our response is also complex and multifaceted, because it has to be.
Yeah. I was just thinking earlier that in terms of human culture, a lot of our ancient mythology and legends and the stories that are around different cultures are to do with forests and to do with particular wild animals. And I was just thinking that, I mean, for instance, in Ireland, a lot of our mythology is around forests. Things like fairies live in the forest. There's particular trees, I don't know what species they are, but there's a mythology around a particular type of tree is called a fairy tree, and it's considered very bad luck to cut it down. So they tend to be sort of, sometimes you find fields of livestock in Ireland with a single kind of old gnarled tree in the middle. And the reason is no one wants to touch it, because there's this very old legend around this is where fairies live and you can't cut it down, you can't trim it or anything. And I was also thinking, something that occurred to me is that one of the Mossy Earth projects is about trying to help eagles to be re-establish their population in Scotland. Isn't that right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Building some eagle nest platforms so that they can have a place to return. That's right. Yeah.
And one of the things that was written was that when eagles were hunted to extinction many years ago, one of the problems was that there was reports of them swooping down and carrying off newborn lambs. And I was just thinking, what this reminds me of is the mythology of dragons.
Yeah.
Of like a huge winged creature like flying around stealing livestock. And I thought it must be some connection there, that of where this like medieval story of dragons comes from, is these like huge eagles stealing farmers' lambs.
Yeah, it's really interesting the way that sort of culture interacts with nature in that way, especially with the predators and so on. There's so much mythology around them as well. You're mentioning trees, but I'm thinking like wolves as well, the stories that exist around wolves, and it's really crazy. We were chatting with our partners in Portugal when I went there for a visit to the livestock guarding dogs, and they were telling me just about these very strange traditions that existed regarding wolves. So before when they used to shoot them, I mean, they had these whole methods to actually chase and shoot the wolves as well. I'd say several decades ago. And they would actually, once they killed the wolf, they would take the trachea of the wolf.
In the throat.
Yeah, the throat, yeah. And they would say that for the sheep that weren't killed to survive the following years, they'd have to drink water from the wolf's throat.
Oh, wow.
So, it's like these things that people come up with that you're like, this is just so crazy. And yeah, I mean, there are endless stories about them and myths and so on.
Fantastic. I mean, I think we're losing that, unfortunately, the more sterilized our environments become. And also the more people who move into cities and don't spend much time out in nature and out in more wild environments, they sort of lose that connection. The idea of the old stories we used to tell in mythology seems very kind of, people were so silly back then to think these things. Actually, it was more about just trying to make sense of the world of humans interacting with wild animals and wild nature all the time, and trying to fit that into a reference point within a culture.
Yeah, it's really interesting how this sort of interaction with nature can also be very rewarding for people, and that it can have so much meaning, especially for these communities, as you're saying, that actually interact with it every day. It's really quite fascinating.
Do you have any standout memories from your work with animals?
One thing actually, when I was in Madagascar, I remember like we were sampling this population of nocturnal lemurs that they live in these cavities in trees. And we're looking for them during the day, which is when they're sleeping, because we were essentially monitoring their populations, and we needed to capture some individuals also to measure them and to check on their health and status. And I remember we saw one actually at one point during the day, and we had been hiking for, it was like the third day we were looking for them, hadn't seen any, and we saw this one, and then we tried to go after it. And then it just hid in one of these trees. And then we actually had to climb the tree, get in there to try and capture it. And I had no idea about this, but they make this most horrendous sound. Like they look like these very like cute creatures, but then once they feel threatened, it sounds like a dragon, you know? And so, yeah, we take this one out, and then we realized actually there was a whole family in that tree.
Oh, wow.
So we managed to actually capture two more and measure them and everything, and get some fur samples, and then just leave them be. But it was just amazing, like that sound there. Yeah, at Mossy Earth, I mean, among the team, we're all a bunch of outdoor enthusiasts and spending a lot of time outdoors. And among the team, there's quite a few different stories. I think we'll be planning to have some of those on the podcast, the Mossy Earth podcast well. Just having the team share some crazy stories. I think that'll be nice.
It's a great idea. Great idea. They're always really fun to hear. One of my sort of what felt like to me was quite a lucky encounter. I was on holiday in Canada, in Vancouver, and I was staying on an island just off the coast of Vancouver called Bowen Island. And we had gone out and done some hiking, done some kayaking, and in the evening we went down to this little beach. We were the only ones there, me and my girlfriend, and we were just sitting looking out over the sea, and then all of a sudden we heard and we looked, and there was two orcas just like a few hundred meters away from the coast, who were swimming along, and I think they call it spy hopping, when they stick their head above the water and they sort of look around and then come back down. And so we were able to watch them for a few minutes, and we thought, oh my god, it's crazy.
Yeah, they're amazing creatures, aren't they?
Really amazing. And those kind of memories stick with you. So I would, that's one of the, I guess, slightly more selfish reasons for promoting rewilding, is that it just gives more opportunity for people to have these we'll say safe and meaningful encounters with wildlife. And hopefully mitigating those more problematic encounters with obviously predators stealing livestock and things like that. I think there's a way we can sort of help people to have those experiences.
Yeah, exactly, and it just feels right, doesn't it? When you're out in nature and you have these experiences, it just feels like that's how it was supposed to be to some extent. And sometimes it's easy to dismiss it as sort of just like, it's just fun. I mean, we have big issues to deal with. But I think that sort of satisfaction you get from those experiences, it sort of can have an impact on your life in different ways. I think this makes me think of the book Feral. I don't know if you've read it. You're mentioning George Mumbai before, and it's a great book. And it also touches on that aspect of having these wild landscapes. It's valuable for the ecosystem services it provides, but also for this feeling you're describing, feeling connected again, feeling excited about being out again. That's a great thing to work for.
Great. Okay, that's a good book recommendation. I'll check that out.
Yeah, it's a great book.
As a sort of final, I guess, sort of wrapping up this discussion, I'd love to ask you, I guess the people who listen to this podcast are mostly, I would say, I hope are sort of motivated individuals who care about the planet and want to be a part of doing something positive. What sort of advice could you give from your perspective about what people can do to have a more positive impact?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question, but unfortunately, I think my answer might be a bit general, but I hope it's useful. So I think one thing is that the same way that with a diet, there's not like one best diet, or with an exercise regime, you can't say like everyone should do this exercise regime. I think the same applies to how you address your own impact on the planet. So this idea of actually doing what works best for you and that has the greatest impact in your situation is really important. So when I was working on the carbon calculator for Mossy Earth as well, that's one of the things that for me was like the most striking, was that the action that has the greatest impact for one person is completely different from the action that has the greatest impact for another person. So my first piece of advice would be to base the things that you do on that kind of information, and not necessarily like, reading an article that talks about the statistics that says, okay, this is the biggest issue, that's the biggest issue, and then just it's sort of like this shouting match that becomes a bit difficult to make sense of. So essentially like addressing your own situation and not worrying too much about what people will judge you like for that, it's a bit like that's one piece of advice that I think it's important. And then the other one is also I think a big barrier that I see that affects a lot of people is a bit this all or nothing mentality. This idea that either you do everything perfectly or it's not worth doing it at all, and I think really that's something it's better just to take that out of your mind and understand that every bit counts, because that's so much more productive and sustainable in the long term. There's also these people that like take these drastic measures for like, a month or something and then
burn out.
Give up on it. Yeah, burn out. And if you look at like the next decades, that's not what's going to have the big impact. It's what you do consistently day in, day out that will have an impact.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, everyone's situation is so specific. And I mean, something that I think a lot of people like myself who live in Europe, we've gotten very used, for instance, for taking a lot of short-haul flights during the year. And so whereas we might be very interested in reducing our impact, let's say around the kind of food we eat, which is obviously a very positive thing to do, if we then don't want to give up any of our 6 or 7 flights we take a year, when you actually look at the figures on that, you realize, oh, my diet is taking up like, X amount of carbon, and the flights I take is like 10 times that. So, it's, and I think having this Mossy Earth calculator, the carbon calculator, is a great resource. You basically go on and just answer questions about your lifestyle, and then it sort of gives you an answer at the end of where different areas of your life are contributing the most to your carbon emissions, and then you can get a more objective view.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, on the one hand, it's exactly what you're saying, is like you see what the biggest contributors are. But what I would also say was that in that example of the food, for example, I think that if someone is not ready to give up on those flights, they shouldn't be discouraged from taking the steps they can regarding the food if that's easier for them.
Yeah.
So that's where sometimes I see the barrier as well. Someone says like, okay, I'm not ready to give up the flights, and so just the whole thing goes out and I give up.
No point.
Yeah, exactly. But it also depends on how people process this themselves. But in my case, this focus on at every point doing the best that you can. It has been the best way for me to make progress in my own life regarding this.
I think that's a great message. I mean, just do what you can. What is possible for you and what is realistic for you, and it all adds up. I mean, if everyone takes a little step in the right direction, it makes a big impact cumulatively.
Yeah, exactly. And bringing it back, for example, to like physical training and so on, I think like long sustainable progress is made through these small incremental steps. Oh, yeah. And that's, I think, a nice way to approach it. That you wouldn't just like essentially do this crazy exercise regimen all at once. But I mean, for some people it works, but for me, the gradual approach is great.
I would just add as well that most people have for instance, a retirement savings account. When you give money to your retirement account, whether it's a particular company that manages it, they invest that money in whatever they think will help you to grow your pot. And often that is things like oil companies, natural gas companies, maybe food companies that are deforesting to grow food. And so you can actually look into that, and many investment companies are now offering ethical investment options. So you can switch your retirement savings, which over the course of your life is a lot of money, that could be going to things that you're not ethically okay with. You can switch that to an ethical pot, and then they'll use that for more beneficial and, let's face it, more long-term sustainable uses. We're not going to be using fossil fuels forever, so why are we investing our money in them? So there's little things like that you may not realize you can have a big impact over the course of your life on. But I'd suggest people check that out in particular.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that also sort of brings it back to this idea that each person has their own situation to address. So for some people, for example, depending on exactly how much money they're investing and so on, the impact that those choices have can be so huge compared to other things that it really makes sense to look into them. And depending on certain, like if you have power to make certain decisions as well, it applies as well. It's really interesting to try and really have that sort of broader picture of the areas where you can have an impact, and to see how difficult they are for you to implement and take all of that into consideration.
So is there anything, I've kind of gone through my list of questions, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you wanted to bring up?
Actually, just before this, I was interested in this idea. So with you were mentioning as well, with a lot of people like living in the cities and then having this interest in restoring nature and so on. I mean, one of the trends now that with the urban populations increasing and so on, that's also related to having these greater opportunities for rewilding in these rural areas that are being abandoned. I don't know if that's something that you have sort of felt yourself, being someone that lives in a city, that you've thought about this issue.
You're right. I never thought about it through that lens, but we obviously do have globally huge rural to urban migration, to the point where we're now above half of the world's population living in cities, going up to projected to be 70% in the coming decades. It never occurred to me that actually, and you're totally right, that means there's a lot of land that will be left, possibly abandoned, in countries all around the world. And there's a question of what's the best way to use that, and how can we, again, you know, this is another opportunity. It's a challenge for cities, but it's also an opportunity to maybe make more sustainable use of this rural land.
Yeah, exactly. It's an exciting time to do both what we're doing at Mossy Earth and to do the things you're talking about on your podcast. So
absolutely,
hopefully it all comes together.
we often think of cities as the places. Obviously, they're the hubs of human activity. They're also the hubs of energy use and carbon emissions. But it's really important that us as urbanists, as people who live and work in cities, don't forget about how important the rural land is. It isn't just a place to grow food for us, although that is obviously a core part of the rural economy and land use. It can also, we should also be thinking about how the land uses there are sustainable, can be in tune with nature, and about how they can help to further our climate change goals in terms of sequestering carbon, and being part of the solution rather than part of the problem.
Yeah, exactly. Having this sort of whole system view, again, that seems to be a recurring theme.
Exactly.
is very important.
Massively important. Thank you so much, Tiago. This has been really fascinating for me. I've learned a lot, and I think people listening will also learn a lot from this. Where can people find out more about Mossy Earth and more about you? Do you want to give us some...
Yeah, definitely. So if you want to learn more about Mossy Earth, you can just go to our website, mossy.earth. And you can also follow us on Instagram. We try and keep it interesting over there with some camera trap footage and interesting things for people to follow. And for those that are interested in this aspect of sustainability and so on, you can use our carbon calculator, which is free to use. And also check a bunch of guides we have in there with tips and information on how to live more sustainably.
That's great. I'll put a link for all of those in my podcast description. So wherever you're listening, you can just check in the description, the podcast notes. You'll be able to go straight to Mossy Earth and find out more.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's great to see what Mossy Earth members get up to, and the great things that you do. And when you reach out and we get to meet you, this is the best.
Oh yeah, it's been a real pleasure for me. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.